June 6, 1944, 07:35 hours. The English Channel off the coast of Normandy, France, and the world is a symphony of chaos written in salt spray and diesel exhaust and the acrid bite of vomit that has long since stopped being embarrassing, because every man in the landing craft has emptied his stomach at least twice in the past 4 hours of violent pitching through waves that rise and fall like the breath of some malevolent god. Private First Class Arthur George Campbell, 23 years old, born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, currently crammed into Landing Craft Assault number 472 with 31 other men of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, is not thinking about glory or liberation or the grand strategic sweep of Operation Overlord. He is thinking about the photograph of his wife, Margaret, tucked inside the waterproof pouch against his chest, and whether the seams will hold against the channel water that sloshes around his ankles, cold as death and smelling of rust and fear. His hands, wrapped around the wooden stock of his Lee Enfield rifle, are shaking not from the cold, though it is barely 11 degrees Celsius, and the wind cuts through his sodden battle dress like a knife through wet paper, but from that specific tremor that the body produces when the mind knows with absolute certainty that mathematics are about to decide who lives and who dies, and Arthur has done the mathematics in his head 100 times since they briefed him at the marshalling area in Southampton. The beach ahead, designated Juno, is 800 yards of open sand defended by concrete emplacements, barbed wire, mines, and approximately 800 German soldiers of the 716th Infantry Division who have had 4 years to prepare for exactly this moment, 4 years to zero in their machine guns, 4 years to pre-register their mortars, 4 years to transform that stretch of French coastline into a killing ground of overlapping fields of fire that exist for one purpose and one purpose, only to ensure that men like Arthur George Campbell never reach the seawall alive. Up to this moment, Arthur had survived 18 months of training, countless exercises on the beaches of Scotland and England that were supposed to simulate this exact scenario, but which, he now realized with the clarity of a man facing execution, had simulated nothing, had prepared him for nothing, because no exercise included the sound of 88mm shells screaming overhead. No exercise included the sight of the landing craft to his left, taking a direct hit and disintegrating into a cloud of splinters and body parts that rained down on the grey water like confetti at a funeral. He had watched men he knew, men he had trained with, men whose names he had learned and whose stories he had heard over cigarettes and watered-down beer in English pubs, simply cease to exist in a fraction of a second, transformed from living, breathing, hoping human beings into red mist and floating debris. And he had not screamed, had not cried, had simply tightened his grip on his rifle and recited the Lord's Prayer under his breath, because that was what his mother had told him to do when he was afraid. And he had never been more afraid in his entire life. But now something different, something that separated this moment from every training exercise and every imagined scenario. In exactly 14 minutes, as the bow ramp of his landing craft drops onto the sand of Nan White sector, Arthur and his platoon are going to attempt something that the German defenders, despite their 4 years of preparation and their concrete bunkers and their carefully calculated kill zones, have fundamentally failed to anticipate. The Germans expected the Canadians to come ashore in orderly waves, to be channeled into predetermined killing fields, to die in neat mathematical progression, as generations of soldiers had died on beaches and in trenches since the invention of the machine gun. They expected discipline and doctrine and the predictable choreography of amphibious assault as it had been practiced since Gallipoli. What they did not expect, what they could not internalize until the ramps dropped and the men poured out, was that these Canadians had been briefed not just to take the beach, but to keep moving, to never stop, to push inland with a ferocity and speed that would shatter the carefully constructed German defense in depth before reinforcements could arrive. They didn't just have superior numbers or naval gunfire support, though they had both. They had something far more dangerous. They had been told explicitly and repeatedly that stopping on the beach meant dying on the beach, and they believed it with a religious fervor born of 18 months of watching training films of Dieppe, where 2 years earlier, Canadian soldiers had been slaughtered on a similar beach because they had been too slow, too cautious, too willing to seek cover instead of pushing forward. To understand why what happened on Juno Beach that morning represented such a catastrophic psychological shock to the German command structure, You have to go back to the fundamental assumptions that had governed German coastal defense doctrine since the fall of France in 1940. The German approach to defending the Atlantic Wall was codified in a doctrine called Küstenverteidigung, coastal defense, but it was less a unified strategy than a series of compromises between competing visions of how to defeat an Allied invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been given command of Army Group B in late 1943, believed passionately that the invasion had to be defeated on the beach itself. In the first hours, before the Allies could establish a foothold, he had seen in North Africa how Allied air superiority made mobile reserves vulnerable, how the desert had swallowed his panzers under a rain of bombs, and he was convinced that the same fate awaited any counterattack force that tried to move in. Daylight in France. His philosophy was simple and brutal: pile the defenders right at the water's edge, make the beach itself the killing ground, destroy the enemy while they were still wet and disorganized and unable to bring their full firepower to bear. This was the concept behind the massive construction program of bunkers, obstacles and minefields that had consumed millions of tons of concrete and steel in the months leading up to June 1944. But Rommel's vision was opposed by other senior commanders, most notably Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who believed that fixed coastal defenses were ultimately futile, that the Allies would break through somewhere no matter how many bunkers were built, and that the real battle would be won by mobile panzer reserves, striking the invasion force once it had committed itself and before it could consolidate. This fundamental disagreement was never resolved. Instead, it was papered over with a compromise that satisfied no one and created a defense that was neither fish nor fowl: static divisions holding the coast with inadequate reserves, positioned too far inland to intervene quickly, a recipe for exactly the kind of piecemeal defeat that was about to unfold on Juno Beach. The defenders at Juno were primarily from the 716th Infantry Division, a static formation composed largely of older soldiers, many in their 30s and 40s, and Osttruppen, conscripted soldiers from Eastern Europe, Poles and Ukrainians, and Russians who had been given the choice between service in the Wehrmacht and death in a prisoner of war camp. These were not elite troops. Their equipment was often second-rate, their motivation questionable, their training focused on manning fixed positions rather than mobile warfare. But they had one overwhelming advantage: they had had years to prepare their positions, to learn every fold in the ground, every dead zone, every approach that could be covered by enfilade fire, and they occupied bunkers built of reinforced concrete that could withstand anything short of a direct hit from a naval gun. Strong Point Nan White 11, the specific fortification that Arthur Campbell's landing craft was heading toward, was a textbook example of German defensive engineering, a central casemate housing a 75mm gun with a 90-degree field of fire covering the beach approach, flanked by two towbrooks, circular concrete pits with machine gun positions, surrounded by a belt of mines, wire, and infantry fighting positions connected by communication trenches. The commander of this position was Lieutenant Werner Pluskat, a 31-year-old former schoolteacher from Hamburg who had been in France since 1941 and who had, in his private moments, begun to doubt whether the invasion would ever come at all, a doubt that was shattered at approximately 0600 hours when he climbed to his observation post and saw, through the morning mist and rain, the largest fleet ever assembled in human history, stretching from horizon to horizon, and felt his stomach drop into his boots. What the German intelligence apparatus knew, what the Fremde Heer West reports accurately assessed, was significant. They knew the general composition of Allied forces in England. They knew that an invasion was coming sometime in 1944. They knew that the Pas-de-Calais was the most logical target, due to its proximity to England and its direct route to the industrial Ruhr. And they knew that the Allies had superior naval and air power that would make any cross-channel operation bloody affair for the defenders. What they failed to grasp, what they couldn't internalize until the ramps splashed down at Juno, was the psychological transformation that had occurred in the Canadian forces since Dieppe. That disaster, where over 900 Canadians died and nearly 2,000 were captured in a single morning, had not broken Canadian morale. It had forged it into something harder and more dangerous, a determination that was less about patriotism than about vengeance, a cold fury that had been distilled through 18 months of training specifically designed to ensure that Dieppe would never happen again. They had prepared for the wrong enemy. They expected soldiers who would seek cover, who would be suppressed by fire, who would huddle behind the seawall and wait for tanks that might never arrive. The predictable behavior of men under fire, as documented in 100 after-action reports from 100 battles. What they got instead were men who had been told, and who believed, that hesitation was death, that the only way off the beach was through the enemy. Men who had rehearsed the assault so many times that their movements were almost automatic, who barely broke stride when the man next to them was cut down, who kept moving forward with a momentum that the German defenders, for all their preparation, had never anticipated. The irony of German preparation was crystallized in the construction priorities at Juno. Thousands of man-hours had been spent building elaborate obstacles on the beach, steel hedgehogs and wooden stakes designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft at high tide, based on the assumption that the Allies would land at high water to minimize the distance the troops would have to cross under fire. But the Canadians came in at low tide, specifically to avoid those obstacles, which meant that the defenders watched in disbelief as the landing craft grounded on sand beyond their carefully prepared trap, rendering weeks of labor meaningless while simultaneously forcing the attackers to cross an extra 200 meters of open beach, a distance that should have been fatal but which, because of the suppressive fire from the destroyers offshore and the sheer velocity of the Canadian advance, became survivable for just enough men to reach the seawall and begin the bloody work of clearing the bunkers. But before the bullets and the blood, there was the man, and Arthur George Campbell was not born to be a soldier. He was shaped into one by circumstances he neither chose nor fully understood. Born on March 17, 1921 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, the second of 4 children to Douglas Campbell, a railway clerk for the Canadian Pacific Railway, who earned $42 a week and drank most of it, and Mary Campbell née Fraser, a woman of fierce Presbyterian faith who had buried 2 infants before Arthur was born, and who saw in her surviving children the only proof she needed that God was occasionally merciful. Arthur's childhood was defined by scarcity and scripture, by cold winters in a drafty house on Selkirk Avenue, where the wind came through the walls like a living thing, by hand-me-down clothes and shoes stuffed with newspaper, by the weekly ritual of church on Sunday, where Reverend MacLeod thundered about sin and redemption, while Arthur fidgeted on the hard wooden pew and dreamed of escape. He was not a remarkable student, earning marks that his teachers described as adequate, a word that would follow him through his early years like a shadow, but he had a gift for mechanical things, an intuitive understanding of how pieces fit together that made him valuable in the machine shop at his school, and later at the grain elevator, where he found work at 17, maintaining the conveyors and hoppers that funneled wheat into railway cars bound for the ports. He earned 18 cents an hour, enough to give half to his mother, and keep enough for himself to take a girl named Margaret O'Brien to the pictures once a month, a courtship conducted in the flickering light of newsreels that showed a world falling apart across the ocean, a world that seemed impossibly distant until it wasn't. His father, Douglas, had served in the Great War, had gone to France with the Canadian Expeditionary Force in 1916, and come back in 1918 with a limp and a silence that filled the house like smoke, a refusal to speak about what he had seen that Arthur interpreted as weakness when he was young and wisdom when he was older, but which in truth was simply the inability of language to capture the particular horror of watching men drown in mud while artillery churned the earth into a landscape indistinguishable from hell. Arthur enlisted on September 12, 1939, 10 days after Canada declared war on Germany, not out of patriotic fervor, but because the grain elevator had cut his hours and the army was paying $1.30 a day, almost double what he made as a mechanic, and because Margaret had said yes when he asked her to marry him, and he needed money to start a family. The recruiting sergeant at Minto Armory looked at his hands, calloused and grease-stained, and asked if he knew anything about engines, and when Arthur said yes, the sergeant smiled and wrote something on a form and told him to report to Camp Shiloh in 2 weeks for basic training. That was 4 years and 9 months ago, a span of time that had transformed him from a nervous 18-year-old who had never fired a rifle into a 23-year-old sergeant who had killed men whose faces he sometimes saw when he closed his eyes, a transformation he could not have imagined, and which he suspected he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. Basic training at Camp Shiloh was 12 weeks of misery, designed to break down the civilian and build up the soldier. 12 weeks of 5 a.m. Reveille and 20-mile marches with full pack and drill sergeants, who seemed to exist solely to find new ways to humiliate recruits. But Arthur discovered something about himself in those weeks that surprised him. He was good at this, good at the physical demands, good at keeping his head when other men panicked, good at the mechanical precision of rifle drill and bayonet practice. His instructors noticed, marking him for leadership potential, and by the end of basic he had been selected for NCO training, a path that led him through advanced infantry tactics at Camp Borden and eventually to England in 1941 with the first wave of Canadian reinforcements. His first experience under fire was not in combat, but in the London Blitz, a night in December 1940, when a German bomb landed on the street outside the pub where he and his section were drinking watered-down ale, the blast shattering the windows and throwing him against the bar hard enough to crack 2 ribs, and he remembered lying on the floor covered in broken glass and plastered dust, ears ringing, watching the ceiling sag, and thinking with perfect clarity, "This is what it feels like to almost die." It was not the dramatic transformation that novels described, no sudden revelation or hardening of resolve, just a quiet recalibration of probability, an understanding that death was not an abstraction, but a physical force that could reach out and touch you at any moment, and that surviving meant being lucky more than being good. The years in England were a blur of training exercises and waiting, endless waiting for an invasion that was always 6 months away, training on beaches that were supposed to replicate Normandy, but which, Arthur now understood, staring at the real thing through the spray, had replicated nothing but the temperature of the water. He rose from private to corporal to sergeant, not through heroism but through competence and attrition, older NCOs rotating home or being transferred, younger men looking up to him because he seemed to know what he was doing even when he didn't. He married Margaret in a rushed ceremony during a 72-hour leave in August 1942, a wedding attended by 6 people in a registry office in Glasgow, and he had seen her exactly 3 times since then, visits measured in hours that always ended with her crying at the train station, while he pretended the dust in the air was making his eyes water. The photograph in his chest pocket was from their wedding day. Margaret in a borrowed dress standing outside the registry office, squinting slightly against the sun, a smile on her face that he had not seen since, and he touched the pocket now, feeling the stiff edge of the photograph through the wet wool of his battle dress, a talisman against the mathematics of the beach ahead. The moral weight of what he was about to do had crystallized slowly over the years, an accumulation of small recognitions rather than a single moment of clarity, the understanding that being a soldier meant being willing to kill and willing to die, that these 2 willingness were inseparable, that you could not claim one without accepting the other. He remembered a conversation in a barn in Kent during a training exercise, rain drumming on the roof, sharing cigarettes with a corporal named Finch, who had been with him since Shiloh, a rare moment of honesty between men who had learned to hide their fears behind jokes and profanity. "You ever think about what happens after?" Finch had asked, and Arthur knew he wasn't talking about after the war, he was talking about after the bullet, the moment when the body you aimed at stopped moving and became a thing instead of a person. Arthur had said something vague about duty and necessity, the standard phrases that meant nothing, but later that night, lying awake on a pile of straw, he had let himself think about it properly, about the German soldier on the other end of his rifle, a man who had a mother and perhaps a wife and perhaps children, a man who was defending his country as surely as Arthur was attacking it, a man whose death would be as real and as permanent as his own. He wrote to Margaret about it, a letter that he tore up 3 times before sending a sanitized version that said only that he was well and missed her and hoped to see her soon, the truth too heavy for paper, too dangerous for censors, too intimate for anyone but himself. The landing craft lurched, engine changing pitch, and Arthur knew they were in the final approach, the moment when training and fear and love and duty all collapsed into a single point, the tip of the ramp that would drop in moments and reveal the beach, the bullets, the future that might be measured in minutes or decades depending on factors entirely beyond his control. He looked at the faces of the men around him, some pale with seasickness, some praying silently, some staring at nothing with the 1,000-yard stare that he recognized from his own reflection, and he felt a surge of something that might have been love or might have been grief, impossible to distinguish in the moment, the knowledge that some of these faces would be gone within the hour, that he might be among them, that the only certainty was uncertainty, and the only action was forward. The ramp chains began to clatter, the bow dipping as the craft grounded on sand, and Arthur heard the coxswain shout something that was lost in the roar of artillery and the chatter of machine guns and the screaming of the wounded already in the water, and he felt his legs moving of their own accord, carrying him toward the light and the noise and the mathematics of Juno Beach, where 800 German defenders were about to discover that they had prepared for an enemy that no longer existed, replaced by something faster and angrier, and utterly committed to the proposition that the only way home was through them, and the only way through was forward, always forward, until the beach was behind them, and the war one day closer to ending. The weapon system that would determine the outcome of the first critical minutes on Juno Beach was not a single piece of equipment, but an integrated doctrine of combined arms that the Canadians had refined through years of bitter learning, beginning with the catastrophe of Dieppe and evolving through countless exercises on the beaches of Scotland and southern England until it became something approaching an industrial process for the application of violence. The official designation was the Combined Operations Assault Technique, but for the men who would execute it under fire, it was simply the drill, a choreographed sequence of movements, suppressive fires, and tactical bounds that had been rehearsed so many times that the body could execute them, while the conscious mind dealt with the terror and confusion of actual combat. For the planners at Combined Operations Headquarters, it was a marvel of tactical engineering, a solution to the problem that had killed so many at Gallipoli and Dieppe: how to get men across a defended beach without them bunching up, going to ground, and dying in place while the machine guns methodically worked through the killing zone. For the soldiers, it was simply the difference between living and dying, a set of rules that replaced thought with action and gave them something to do besides curl into a ball and wait for the inevitable. The key innovation was not technological but psychological, the explicit understanding, drilled into every man until it was as automatic as breathing, that cover on the beach was a trap, that the seawall and the shell craters and the obstacles that seemed to offer protection were in fact designed to hold men in place, while pre-registered mortars and machine guns destroyed them at leisure, and that the only safe place on a defended beach was the enemy position itself, reached at maximum speed, regardless of casualties. This was not natural. Every instinct in the human body screamed to find cover when bullets cracked overhead, to make yourself small, to hide, and overcoming that instinct required a deliberate rewiring of the survival response that could only be achieved through repetition so intense that the trained behavior overrode the primitive brain. The men of the Queen's Own Rifles had practiced the beach assault more than 40 times in the 18 months leading up to D-Day, wading through cold Scottish surf, advancing under simulated fire, learning to ignore the blanks cracking around them and focus on the objective, and each repetition carved the pattern deeper into their neural pathways until it became as unconscious as walking. The physical tools that supported this doctrine were carefully integrated to maximize suppressive effect during the critical transition from water to land. The LCA landing craft assault was a British-designed vessel with a ramp that dropped forward to allow 36 fully equipped soldiers to exit in approximately 11 seconds, a number that had been calculated through extensive testing and which represented the time window between when the ramp dropped and when the enemy machine gunners adjusted their aim from the waterline to the emerging troops. The craft itself was armored with thin steel plate that could stop rifle fire but not heavy machine guns, and it sat low in the water to present a minimal target. But these were marginal protections against the 75mm gun that Lieutenant Pluscat had trained on the approach lanes, a weapon that could put a shell through both sides of an LCA without noticing the steel in between. What mattered more than the armor was the timing. The landing was scheduled for precisely the moment when the naval bombardment lifted from the beach defenses and shifted inland, a window of perhaps 30 seconds when the German defenders would be stunned, disoriented, emerging from whatever shelter they had found during the barrage, their ears ringing and their coordination shattered by the concussion of naval shells that weighed more than a man and exploded with the force to level a house. In those 30 seconds, while the defenders were psychologically and physically disabled, the Canadians were supposed to be sprinting across the sand, covering the distance before the machine guns could be remanned and the kill zones re-established, a race between human recovery time and human running speed that everything depended upon. The fire support plan was a masterpiece of destruction on paper, involving 3 distinct phases, coordinated to the minute across assets that ranged from battleships to bombers to tanks swimming through the surf. Phase 1 was the aerial bombardment, scheduled to begin at 0550 and continue for 30 minutes, with heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force dropping 4,000-pound blockbuster bombs on the identified strongpoints along the beach, The theory being that even if the bombs didn't score direct hits on the hardened bunkers, the concussion and cratering would disrupt communications, collapse trenches, and psychologically prepare the defenders for the annihilation that was coming. Phase 2 was the naval bombardment, which would begin at 0620 and continue until the last possible moment before the landing craft touched sand, destroyers and cruisers, and the battleship HMS Warspite, pouring thousands of shells onto the beach defenses from ranges as close as 2 miles, close enough that the German gunners could see the muzzle flashes, but too far for their own weapons to effectively respond. A one-sided slaughter that was supposed to leave the bunkers cracked and the defenders dead or demoralized. Phase 3 was the assault itself, supported by DD tanks, amphibious Sherman tanks equipped with canvas flotation screens and propellers that allowed them to swim ashore ahead of the infantry, their 75mm guns providing direct fire support against any positions that had survived the preliminary bombardment, and by Centaur tanks carrying 95mm howitzers that would fire over the heads of the advancing infantry, walking their shells up the beach like a curtain of steel that pushed the defenders back from their firing positions. On paper, it was overwhelming, a coordinated application of firepower that should have rendered the beach defenses untenable before the first infantryman's boot touched sand. In practice, as Arthur Campbell was about to discover, paper burned easily. The system functioned when it functioned through a precise sequence of interdependent events that left no margin for the chaos that was about to unfold. First, the bombers would identify their targets through radar and visual reference, approach at altitudes high enough to avoid the worst of the flak, and release their payloads on calculated drop points that accounted for wind speed, aircraft velocity, and the ballistic characteristics of each bomb type, a complex equation that worked reliably in training but which, on the morning of June 6th, was complicated by the 10/10ths cloud cover that obscured the ground and forced the bombardiers to rely entirely on radar, a technology that could locate a city but struggled to distinguish a specific bunker from the surrounding terrain. The result was predictable in retrospect, but unforeseen in the moment. The bombs fell late, their release delayed by seconds that translated into hundreds of meters of error, and instead of cratering the beach defenses, they cratered the fields and villages inland, killing cows and farmers, but leaving the concrete bunkers completely untouched, their occupants shaken by the distant thunder, but entirely functional. Second, the naval bombardment was supposed to continue until H-hour -5 minutes, the destroyers walking their fire up the beach in a precisely timed creeping barrage that would force the defenders to keep their heads down until the landing craft were almost at the waterline. But the same rough seas that were making the soldiers vomit in the landing craft were also affecting the accuracy of the naval guns, shells that should have struck within meters of their targets instead falling wild, some short into the water, some long into the dunes, a scattered pattern that looked impressive from a distance, but which left entire strongpoints undamaged. Lieutenant Pluskat, crouched in his observation post watching the fleet approach, had felt the ground shake with the bombardment, had prayed as chunks of concrete fell from the ceiling and dust filled the air, but when the shelling lifted and he crawled to his vision slit, his 75mm gun was still intact, his machine gun crews were still alive, and the beach in front of him was smooth and unmarked, the obstacles standing exactly as his men had placed them, a perfect killing ground waiting for its victims. Third, the DD tanks that were supposed to swim ashore ahead of the infantry and provide fire support were launching into seas far rougher than the equipment was designed to handle, waves of 4 to 5 feet that swamped the low-riding vehicles and collapsed the fragile canvas screens that kept them afloat, sending tank after tank to the bottom of the channel, with their crews trapped inside, men who had trained for months for this moment, drowning in the cold darkness without ever seeing the beach they were supposed to liberate. Of the 40 DD tanks launched toward Juno Beach, 14 sank within minutes of entering the water, their crews pounding uselessly against hatches that couldn't be opened against the pressure of the incoming sea, and many of those that survived the swim arrived late, after the infantry had already hit the beach without the armor support they had been promised, facing the undamaged bunkers with nothing but rifles and grenades and the velocity of their own bodies. This was the gap between planning and reality, the void that swallowed good intentions and spit out corpses, and it was into this void that Arthur Campbell's landing craft was now plunging, the coxswain fighting the wheel as a swell lifted the stern and slewed them sideways. The soldiers inside thrown against each other, rifles clattering, voices raised in the eternal profanity of men who know they are about to face death and can do nothing but curse it. The shore was visible now through the spray, a grey line interrupted by dark shapes that Arthur knew were bunkers, and above the roar of the engine and the crash of the waves, he could hear the distinct ripping canvas sound of German machine guns, MG-42s firing at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound that the training manuals described as distinctive and which the soldiers called the buzz saw, a weapon so fast that individual shots could not be distinguished, just a continuous roar that shredded anything in its path. The ramp was going to drop in less than a minute, and Arthur was running through the drill in his mind, the sequence of movements he had practiced so many times, the sprint from the craft to the waterline, the dash across the open sand to the seawall, the pause that wasn't really a pause but a gathering of momentum before the final rush to the bunkers, each phase no more than 15 seconds, because that was how long the instructors said you had before the machine gunners found you. 15 seconds to cover 40 meters, 15 seconds that would feel like hours, or like nothing at all depending on factors that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with luck. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, a drumbeat that seemed to synchronize with the thud of shells landing somewhere ahead, and he thought of Margaret, of the photograph in his pocket, of the child she had written about in her last letter, the pregnancy she had confirmed just 3 weeks ago, the life growing inside her that he might never see, and he felt something that might have been rage or might have been sorrow, a burning in his chest that had nothing to do with the salt, spray in his lungs. The man beside him, a private named Henderson who had joined the platoon only 2 months ago, and who Arthur had barely gotten to know, was praying aloud, the words tumbling out in a continuous stream that mixed scripture with profanity, in a combination that would have shocked Reverend MacLeod but which seemed entirely appropriate under the circumstances, and Arthur found himself joining in, not the words, but the rhythm, the human need to fill the silence with something, anything, that wasn't the sound of their own fear. 30 seconds now, maybe less, the beach looming larger, the bunkers resolving into distinct shapes, and Arthur could see flashes from the embrasures, the wink of muzzle fire that meant death reaching out toward them, and he watched the water around the landing craft begin to dance with impacts, bullets striking the surface like rain, a deadly rain that was searching for them, probing for the thin steel hull that was the only thing between them and the channel. The craft beside them, LCA 474, took a burst that raked the port side, and Arthur saw men jerk and fall inside it, glimpses through the spray, arms thrown up, bodies crumpling, and then the craft slewed sideways as the coxswain was hit, veering out of formation, and he knew without counting that 8 or 10 men had just died, men he had drunk with and trained with, gone between one heartbeat and the next, and there was nothing to do but keep moving, keep breathing, keep waiting for the ramp to drop. The coxswain of Arthur's craft was screaming something, instructions or prayers or curses, the words lost in the noise, and then the bow struck sand with a grinding shudder that threw everyone forward, and before Arthur could register what was happening, the ramp was dropping, the chains clanging, the grey rectangle of sky tilting down to reveal the beach, the sand, the wire, the bunkers, the war, and he was moving before conscious thought caught up, his body executing the drill while his mind floated somewhere above, watching himself run into the bullets like a man running into a storm. The water was waist-deep and cold, shockingly cold despite everything, and his boots immediately filled with sand and water that made every step an effort. The rifle held high above his head to keep the action dry, and around him were other men, other shapes struggling through the surf, some already falling, already floating face down in the pink-tinged water, and Arthur did not look at them, could not look at them, could only focus on the strip of beach ahead and the 15 seconds that separated him from the seawall. The machine gun fire was a physical presence, a pressure in the air that seemed to push against him, and he could hear bullets cracking past his ears, a sound like whips snapping, and he felt something tug at his sleeve, and knew without looking that the fabric had been torn by a round that had missed his flesh by less than an inch, a margin so thin that luck seemed inadequate to describe it, only the indifference of mathematics, the random distribution of lead through space that killed some men, and spared others for reasons that had nothing to do with deserving. He was out of the water now, boots crunching on wet sand, legs pumping, lungs burning with the effort, and the seawall was perhaps 50 meters ahead, a low concrete barrier topped with wire that looked impossibly far and impossibly close at the same time, and he counted the seconds in his head, 5, 6, 7, each number a victory, each step a defeat of probability, and he could feel men falling around him, the formation disintegrating into chaos. But he did not stop, could not stop, because stopping was dying, and he had a photograph in his pocket and a child he had never seen, and a wife who was waiting, and he would not let the mathematics win. Not today, not yet. Henderson, the praying private, was beside him, and then was not, a burst catching him across the chest and spinning him sideways, and Arthur saw his face in that moment, the expression of surprise more than pain, the realization that the numbers had come up wrong, and then Henderson was behind him on the sand, not moving, and Arthur was still running, still counting, 11, 12, 13, the seawall growing larger, and he knew he was going to make it, knew it with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, because the alternative was unthinkable and he simply refused to think it. He hit the seawall at 14 seconds, throwing himself against the concrete so hard that his helmet cracked against the wall and his vision went white for a moment, and then he was there, in the minimal cover of the wall, gasping for breath, his rifle somehow still in his hands, and he realized that he was alive, that he had crossed the beach, that the first part of the impossible was done, and now all that remained was the rest of it, the bunkers that were still firing, the defenders that were still killing, the 11 miles that stretched between this blood-soaked sand, and the objective that no one believed they would reach before nightfall. Around him, other men were reaching the wall, some whole, some wounded, all breathing in the same ragged gasps, and Arthur began to take stock, to count faces, to see who had made it, and who was lying on the sand behind them, and the numbers were terrible. Half the men who had been in his landing craft were gone, dead or dying or simply missing in the chaos, and the war had been happening for less than 3 minutes. Lieutenant Werner Pluskat, watching through his vision slit, felt the first stirrings of something he had not expected to feel. Fear, not fear of dying. He had made peace with that possibility years ago, but fear of failing, fear that the carefully prepared defenses he had spent years constructing were not going to hold, that the Canadians pressing against the seawall below him were not going to stop, that the momentum of the assault was going to carry them over his position and into the interior, before the reinforcements that High Command kept promising could possibly arrive. He had expected the enemy to hesitate, to go to ground under his fire, to present stationary targets that his machine gunners could methodically destroy. But these men were not hesitating. They were dying, but they were not stopping, and each second that passed brought more of them to the seawall, more rifles pointed at his embrasure, more grenades being readied for the throw that would silence his guns. The mathematics of his position, which had seemed so favorable on paper, were shifting in ways he had not anticipated. The careful calculus of overlapping fields of fire and pre-registered kill zones crumbling under the weight of an enemy who simply refused to behave as expected, and he felt the cold certainty settling in his stomach that this was going to be a different kind of battle than he had prepared for. A battle where the defenders were not just outgunned but outwilled, where the only question was not whether the line would break, but how long it would hold and how many men would die before it did. The assault on the bunkers began at 07:52, 17 minutes after the first Canadians had hit the beach, and it was not the coordinated company-level attack that the planning documents had envisioned, but something far more primal, small groups of men acting on instinct and training, moving through the chaos with a desperate efficiency, born of the understanding that stopping meant dying, and that the only way to stop the machine guns was to get close enough to kill the men behind them. Arthur Campbell, pressed against the seawall with 11 other survivors from his landing craft, could see the embrasure of the nearest bunker perhaps 40 meters to his left, the dark rectangle from which the MG-42 was still firing in long, methodical bursts, the gunner inside traversing his weapon across the beach with the mechanical rhythm of a man who had done this in training 1,000 times and who was now simply executing the drill while Canadians died in the sand below him. The bunker was a Widerstands nest, a resistance nest in German military terminology, designated WN-27 on the intelligence maps that Arthur had memorized during the briefings in England, a reinforced concrete structure with walls 2 meters thick that had been designed to withstand direct hits from naval guns, and which had in fact survived the bombardment without a scratch, its field of fire covering a 60-degree arc that encompassed the entire approach from Nan White sector, and which had already accounted for at least 30 Canadian dead in the first 3 minutes of the assault. The only way to silence it was from the flanks or the rear, where the concrete was thinner and where the embrasure created a blind spot that a man could exploit if he was fast enough and lucky enough and willing to accept the near certainty of death that came with exposing himself to the interlocking fire from the adjacent positions. Arthur looked at the men around him, saw the same calculation happening behind their eyes, the weighing of odds that was not really calculation at all, but something older and deeper, the biological imperative to survive wrestling with the trained response to attack, and he knew that someone had to move first, that the momentum of the assault was bleeding away with every second they spent pinned against the wall, and that if they stayed here, the mortars would find them and finish what the machine guns had started. He caught the eye of Corporal Finch, the man he had talked to in that barn in Kent about what came after, and something passed between them that did not require words, an acknowledgement that the moment had arrived when talk became action and action became consequence, and Arthur nodded once, a small motion that committed both of them to whatever was about to happen. The technique for bunker assault had been drilled into them until it was automatic. One fire team provides suppressive fire on the embrasure, forcing the gunner to duck or die, while the assault team moves along the blind side, using whatever cover exists, grenades through the aperture or the ventilation shaft, then in through the rear entrance with bayonets and close-quarters violence that left no room for hesitation or mercy. It sounded clean in the training manuals, a series of steps that led logically from problem to solution, but the training manuals did not account for the way the sand sucked at your boots, or the way the fear made your hands shake, or the way the man you were trying to kill was also trying to kill you and was very good at his job. Arthur pulled 2 grenades from his webbing, the Mills bombs that weighed about 1.5 pounds each, and which would detonate 4 seconds after the pin was pulled, and he showed them to Finch, who nodded and began gesturing to the other men, organizing the suppressive fire that would give Arthur the seconds he needed to cross the open ground. The plan, such as it was, came together in fragments of hand signals and shouted words that were barely audible over the gunfire, a plan that was less a plan than a shared understanding that they were about to do something insane and that some of them would not survive it, but that the alternative was to sit here and die anyway, and at least this way there was a chance, however small, that they might accomplish something worth dying for. At 07:54, Finch raised his hand and dropped it, and 6 rifles opened up on the bunker embrasure simultaneously, a ragged volley that probably did not hit anything, but which forced the machine gunner to pull back from his weapon for a fraction of a second. And in that fraction Arthur was moving, his legs driving him away from the wall and across the open sand toward the concrete flank of the bunker that rose from the beach like the prow of a ship. The distance was perhaps 30 meters, a span that he could cover in 6 seconds at a dead sprint under normal conditions. But these were not normal conditions. His boots were full of water and sand, his equipment was dragging at him, and every step felt like running through glue while the world exploded around him in a symphony of noise and violence that made coherent thought impossible. He did not think about dying, did not think about Margaret, did not think about anything except the next step and the step after that, his entire existence compressed into the immediate present, the concrete growing larger in his vision, the texture of the Zimmerit coating becoming visible, the dark rectangle of the ventilation shaft that was his target appearing on the bunker's flank, like a mouth waiting to swallow the grenades in his hands. The machine gun swung back toward him at the 4-second mark, the gunner having realized that the suppressive fire was a diversion, and Arthur felt rounds crack past him so close that he could feel the displaced air on his face, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was about to die, that the next burst would find him, that his luck had finally run out on this grey beach 10,000 kilometers from home. And then he was there, slamming against the concrete wall of the bunker, out of the machine gun's arc of fire, gasping for breath, his hands shaking so badly that he almost dropped the first grenade as he pulled the pin and shoved it into the ventilation shaft, a motion that took perhaps 2 seconds but which felt like an eternity, and then he was pulling the second pin and throwing that one through as well, and pressing himself flat against the wall and counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and the world inside the bunker became hell. The double explosion was muffled by the concrete, but still powerful enough to shake dust from the walls, and Arthur heard screaming from inside, a sound that would live in his memory for the rest of his life, the high-pitched shriek of men being torn apart by shrapnel in an enclosed space. And then there was a secondary explosion, as the stored ammunition cooked off, and a gout of flame shot from the embrasure like the breath of a dragon, and the machine gun fell silent. He did not feel triumph, did not feel satisfaction, felt only a cold emptiness that might have been shock or might have been the first symptoms of what later generations would call combat stress reaction, the psyche's desperate attempt to wall off experiences too intense for normal processing. There was no time to dwell on it. The adjacent bunker, WN-28, was still firing, and the assault was still happening, and Arthur forced his legs to move, forced his hands to reload, forced his eyes to scan for the next threat, the next objective, the next step in the endless sequence that was the only thing keeping him alive. The clearing of the beach defenses took 47 minutes, a span of time that would later be compressed into a few paragraphs in the official histories, but which, for the men who lived through it, stretched into something approaching infinity, each second weighted with decisions that meant life or death, each bunker a separate battle that had to be fought and won before the next one could be addressed. Arthur's platoon, or what remained of it, cleared 3 bunkers in that span, each assault a variation on the same desperate theme: suppressive fire, movement, grenades, close combat, and then the brief, terrible silence before the next position opened up and the cycle began again. He killed 4 men that morning, or perhaps 5, the count blurred by the chaos and the smoke, and the way the fighting merged into a continuous present that defied normal memory, and each killing was different, and each was the same, a moment of violent intimacy that connected him to another human being in the act of ending their existence, and he knew that he would carry those moments with him until he died, knew that they had changed something fundamental in his being that could never be changed back. The breakthrough came at 08:39, when the last bunker covering the exit from Nan White sector was silenced by a direct hit from a Churchill tank that had finally made it ashore, the 75mm shell punching through the embrasure and detonating inside with a violence that collapsed the entire structure into a pile of rubble and body parts, and suddenly there was nothing between the Canadians and the interior of France except open fields and scattered hedgerows and the villages that, intelligence said, were lightly defended. The order came down the line, shouted from man to man, passed through the chaos like a current. Push inland, don't stop, keep moving. The words that had been drilled into them since the first day of training, the commandment that overrode every other consideration, and Arthur found himself moving again, his exhausted legs carrying him off the sand and onto the grass of occupied France, a transition that felt like crossing from one world into another, the beach behind him a nightmare landscape of bodies and burning vehicles, and the constant crackle of small arms fire that faded with distance, but never quite disappeared. The push inland was supposed to be the easy part, the exploitation phase that followed the hard work of breaching the beach defenses, but the men who planned the operation had not accounted for the resilience of the German defenders or the speed with which they could reorganize, and within minutes of leaving the beach the Canadians began to encounter resistance that, while less concentrated than the bunkers, was no less deadly. Snipers in church steeples, machine gun teams in farmhouse windows, mortar crews hidden in orchards, a web of opposition that materialized out of the Norman countryside like ghosts and which had to be destroyed piece by piece, house by house, field by field, in a grinding advance that consumed men and ammunition at a rate that the planners had not anticipated. Arthur's platoon, now reduced to 17 men from the original 36 who had loaded into the landing craft that morning, found themselves attacking a fortified farmhouse on the outskirts of a village called Bernières-sur-Mer at approximately 09:15, a stone building with walls thick enough to stop rifle fire and windows that had been converted into firing positions by the German garrison inside. The assault was a microcosm of the entire operation: hasty planning, inadequate fire support, and raw courage substituting for everything else. A dozen men sprinting across an open field toward a building that was spitting fire from every aperture, while their comrades tried to suppress the defenders with weapons that were not designed for this kind of fight. The Bren gunner went down at the 20-meter mark, his chest opened by a burst from inside the farmhouse, and Arthur watched him fall and kept running because stopping was dying, and the lesson of the beach was burned into his nervous system now, a reflex that overrode fear and exhaustion, and the screaming voice in his head that told him he was insane. He made it to the wall of the farmhouse, pressed himself against the stone, heard the firing from inside and knew that the same sequence was about to repeat. Grenade through the window, wait for the explosion, in through the door with bayonet fixed, the intimate violence of room clearing that reduced warfare to its most primal elements. The grenade went through clean. The explosion shook dust from the ceiling, and Arthur went through the door half a second later, his rifle up, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, and he found himself face to face with a German soldier who could not have been more than 18 years old, a boy in a uniform that was too big for him, holding a rifle that was pointed at Arthur's chest, and for a frozen moment they stared at each other across 3 meters of space, two human beings connected by the certain knowledge that one of them was about to die. The German fired first, a shot that went wide because his hands were shaking worse than Arthur's, and Arthur felt the round pass his ear close enough to deafen him temporarily, and then his own rifle was coming up, and his finger was squeezing the trigger, and the bullet took the boy in the throat, and he went down gurgling, his hands clawing at the wound, his eyes wide with the surprise that every dying man seems to feel, the disbelief that this could be happening to them, that the universe could be so indifferent to their individual existence. Arthur stood over him and watched him die, which took about 30 seconds, and he felt nothing, absolutely nothing, a void where emotion should have been, and he understood in that moment that something inside him had been killed on this day too, something that would never come back, no matter how long he lived or how far he traveled from this stone farmhouse in a country he had never seen before. The rest of the farmhouse was cleared in the next 2 minutes. 3 more German soldiers killed in the rooms and the cellar, their bodies left where they fell because there was no time to do anything else, and then the platoon was moving again, pushing toward the next objective, the next village, the next fight, a rhythm that would continue for the rest of the day and into the night, and for weeks and months beyond, a rhythm that would become the texture of Arthur's existence until the war ended, or he did. By noon, the Queen's Own Rifles had advanced approximately 4 miles inland from Juno Beach, a distance that exceeded expectations and which came at a cost that the official records would quantify as 340 casualties, killed and wounded in a single morning, numbers that represented the destruction of nearly half the battalion's fighting strength, but which, in the calculus of amphibious operations, was considered acceptable because the beachhead was secure and the momentum was maintained, and the Germans were falling back faster than they could establish new defensive lines. Arthur did not know the numbers, did not know anything except the next 100 meters of ground and the next enemy position, and the constant, grinding exhaustion that was settling into his bones like lead, an exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something spiritual. The depletion of whatever reserves of strength and will had carried him through the morning. He ate cold rations during a 10-minute halt in a ditch beside a country road, mechanically spooning beans into a mouth that tasted of cordite and blood, and he thought about Margaret and the photograph in his pocket, and the child he might never see, and he felt the first stirrings of something that might have been hope or might have been despair, the understanding that he had survived the beach, but that survival was not an ending, only a continuation, and that tomorrow there would be another. Battle and another after that until the war was won or he was dead. The German defenders of Juno Beach, or those who survived the morning, were in full retreat by mid-afternoon, the carefully prepared defensive positions abandoned, the artillery that was supposed to destroy the beachhead still sitting in its emplacements because the crews had fled or been killed, a collapse of military organization that exceeded the worst fears of the German High Command and which would have consequences that rippled far beyond this single stretch of Norman coastline. Lieutenant Werner Pluskat, the schoolteacher from Hamburg who had watched the invasion fleet appear on the horizon that morning, was among the survivors, retreating inland with the remnants of his platoon, perhaps a dozen men from the original 40 who had manned the strongpoint, and he carried with him a knowledge that he would struggle to articulate for the rest of his life, the knowledge that everything he had been told about the enemy, everything he had believed about German superiority and Allied weakness had been a lie, or at least a truth so partial that it amounted to the same thing. He had watched his carefully prepared defenses crumble in less than an hour, had seen his men die in bunkers that were supposed to be impregnable, had felt the momentum of the assault sweep over his position like a wave that could not be stopped by concrete or steel or courage, and he understood now that this war was going to end differently than the propaganda had promised, that the thousands of kilometers of conquered territory that stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow were going to shrink day by day, battle by battle, until there was nothing left but the ruins of a dream that had consumed a generation. The 11 miles that the title promised, the distance that the 800 defenders would lose in a single day, was achieved by nightfall on June 6th, as Canadian armored units pushed through the gaps created by the infantry and exploited the chaos of the German retreat. their tanks grinding forward along roads that had been quiet for 4 years and which were now filled with the debris of a collapsing occupation, abandoned vehicles, discarded equipment, the bodies of soldiers who had not retreated fast enough, the whole detritus of an army that was discovering for the first time since 1939 what it felt like to be on the wrong end of a blitzkrieg. Arthur Campbell did not see the 11-mile mark. By then he was sitting in a field dressing station, having a piece of shrapnel removed from his thigh, a wound he did not remember receiving, a souvenir of some explosion in some nameless field that his memory had already begun to blur and suppress in the way that traumatized minds protect themselves from experiences too intense to process. The medic who worked on him, a corporal from Saskatchewan with steady hands and tired eyes, told him he was lucky that the fragment had missed the femoral artery by less than a centimeter, and Arthur nodded and said nothing, because luck seemed like a word from another language, a concept that had lost all meaning on a day when so many men had been unlucky and he had not, and the only explanation was the randomness of the universe, the same randomness that had killed Henderson on the beach and the German boy in the farmhouse, and the thousands of others whose names he would never know. He lay on the stretcher and stared at the canvas roof of the tent and listened to the moans of the other wounded and the distant thunder of artillery that meant the advance was continuing, that the war was rolling forward without him, and he thought about the photograph in his pocket and the letter he would write to Margaret when he could hold a pen again, the letter that would say nothing about what had happened because there were no words for what had happened, only the silence that his father had brought back from the Somme. The silence that Arthur now understood was not weakness but wisdom, the knowledge that some experiences could not be shared, only endured. The night of June 6, 1944, fell over Normandy like a shroud, and with it came a silence that was not really silence at all, but merely the absence of the continuous violence that had defined the daylight hours, a relative quiet, punctuated by the distant crump of artillery and the occasional burst of small arms fire that reminded everyone that the war had not ended, had merely paused to catch its breath before resuming its consumption of human lives. Arthur Campbell lay on his stretcher in the field dressing station and could not sleep, not because of the pain in his thigh, which the morphine had reduced to a dull throb, but because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the German boy in the farmhouse, the expression of surprise and terror, frozen in the instant before the bullet struck, an image that had burned itself into his visual cortex and which would remain there, he somehow knew, for the rest of his life. The tent was full of wounded men, perhaps 30 of them arranged in rows on stretchers and cots, some sleeping the drugged sleep of the heavily sedated, others moaning softly in the darkness, others simply staring at the canvas ceiling as Arthur was, each man alone with memories that could not be shared and wounds that went deeper than any shrapnel. A corporal from the North Shore Regiment on the stretcher beside him was weeping quietly, a continuous stream of tears that he made no effort to wipe away, his hands wrapped in bandages that concealed burns from a flamethrower incident that Arthur did not want to imagine, and the sound of his grief was somehow worse than the screams had been, more intimate, more human, a reminder that the bodies being treated in this tent still contained souls that were being damaged in ways that no surgeon could repair. Arthur thought about his father, about the silence that had defined Thomas Campbell's return from the Great War, the way he would sometimes stop in the middle of a sentence and stare at nothing, his eyes focused on something invisible that only he could see, and Arthur understood now that his father had not been weak, had not been damaged in some shameful way that required hiding, but had simply been carrying a weight that could not be set down, a burden that became part of you and remained, part of you until you died, reshaping your soul around its contours until you forgot what you had been before you acquired it. He wondered if he would become like his father, if Margaret would notice the change in him, if the child growing inside her would ever know the man he had been before this day, or if that man was already dead, killed somewhere on the beach or in the farmhouse, replaced by someone who looked the same but was fundamentally different, a survivor rather than a person, a collection of reflexes and suppressions that had once been a human being. The letter he eventually wrote to Margaret, 3 days later when his hand was steady enough to hold a pen, said nothing about any of this. It said that he was well, that he had been slightly wounded but was recovering, that he thought about her every day and could not wait to meet their child, the same bland reassurances that every soldier wrote, because the truth was impossible to convey and would only cause pain if it could be conveyed, a conspiracy of silence that stretched across oceans and generations, connecting fathers to sons in a lineage of unspoken trauma that would not be named or understood until long after the men who carried it were dead. The official records of D-Day, compiled in the weeks and months that followed, would reduce the chaos of that morning to statistics and maps, clean lines showing the advance inland, neat numbers tabulating the casualties by unit and sector, a sanitized version of events that bore the same relationship to reality as a photograph bears to the thing photographed, accurate in its details, but missing everything essential, the smell and the fear and the specific weight of killing a man whose eyes you could see. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada would be credited with one of the deepest penetrations inland on D-Day, their advance of approximately 11 miles exceeding the objectives assigned to them and contributing to the strategic success of the entire Normandy operation. And in the regimental histories this would be presented as a triumph, proof of Canadian courage and determination, a source of pride for generations of soldiers who would wear the same cap badge and carry the same traditions. What the histories would not capture, could not capture, was the cost measured in something other than bodies, the invisible wounds that the survivors carried home with them, the nightmares and the drinking and the marriages that failed, and the children who grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally absent, the long tail of damage that extended decades beyond the last shot fired. Arthur Campbell returned to Winnipeg in September 1945, a sergeant with a military medal he never talked about and a limp that would gradually fade over the years until it was barely noticeable. And he met his daughter for the first time in the living room of the house on Selkirk Avenue, a 15-month-old girl named Elizabeth, who looked at him with the wariness of a child confronting a stranger and cried when he tried to hold her. Margaret had changed too, the war years having carved lines into her face that had not been there when he left, and they stood in the living room like two people who had once known each other and were now trying to remember how, the distance between them measurable not in miles, but in experiences that could not be shared, a gap that would never fully close no matter how many years they spent together. They built a life, the kind of life that veterans built in the post-war years, a house in the suburbs and 2 more children, and a job at the grain elevator that paid better now because the unions had gotten stronger, and from the outside, it looked like success, like the Canadian dream fulfilled, a family and a home and a future stretching forward into the prosperous decades that followed the war. But Arthur never talked about Normandy, never talked about the beach or the bunkers or the farmhouse, and Margaret learned not to ask, learned to accept the silences and the nights when he would wake up shouting in a language of terror that had no words, learned to recognize the distant look that would come over his face sometimes when a car backfired or a child's scream reached a certain pitch, the triggers that sent him back to a place she could not follow and from which he returned each time, a little more diminished, a little more absent, a little more lost. The drinking started in 1952, not the social drinking that everyone did, but the serious drinking, the bottle hidden in the garage, the breath that smelled of rye whiskey at breakfast, the slow dissolution of a man who had survived the war only to be destroyed by the peace. Margaret considered leaving, talked about it with her sister in whispered conversations after the children were in bed, but she stayed, partly because divorce was shameful in those years, and partly because she remembered the man Arthur had been before the war, the young mechanic who had taken her to the pictures and proposed on a park bench and written letters from England that were full of hope and plans for the future, and she could not abandon the ghost of that man, even as the living version disappeared into a bottle. Arthur hit bottom in 1958, a night when he came home so drunk he could barely stand, and Elizabeth, now 14 years old, looked at him with an expression that combined pity and contempt in equal measure, and he saw himself reflected in his daughter's eyes and understood that he had become his father, had repeated the pattern that he had sworn to break, had passed the damage down to another generation like a cursed inheritance that could not be refused. He stopped drinking the next day, not through any program or treatment but through sheer willpower, the same willpower that had carried him across the beach at Juno, and he never touched alcohol again for the remaining 31 years of his life, though the demons that had driven him to drink did not disappear, merely found other outlets, other ways to manifest in a man who had learned to suppress everything and had thereby suppressed his own humanity. The breakthrough, such as it was, came in 1984, 40 years after D-Day, when a letter arrived from France, forwarded through the Canadian Legion and the Department of Veterans Affairs, a letter that had been written by a woman named Marie-Claire Pluscat, the daughter of Werner Pluscat, the German lieutenant who had commanded the bunker that Arthur's platoon had destroyed on that morning 4 decades earlier. The letter explained that Werner Pluskat had survived the war, had returned to Hamburg, and resumed his career as a schoolteacher, had married and had children and grandchildren, and had died in 1982 at the age of 70, but that before he died he had written a memoir of his wartime experiences, including a detailed account of June 6, 1944, and the assault on his position by Canadian soldiers whose determination had shattered everything he thought he knew about the enemy. Marie-Claire had found the memoir while sorting through her father's papers, and she had been struck by a passage in which her father described watching the Canadians advance across the beach, walking into his machine gun fire as if they were immune to death, and she had felt compelled to reach out, to make contact with someone from the other side, to understand the men who had been her father's enemies, and who had haunted his dreams just as surely as he had haunted theirs. Arthur did not respond to the letter for 3 months. It sat on his desk in the small room he used as a study, the room where he went when the memories became too heavy and he needed to be alone. And he would pick it up sometimes and read it again and put it down and stare at the wall, trying to process the information that the man whose bunker he had destroyed had survived, had lived a life, had children who wanted to understand, had been human in all the ways that Arthur had spent 40 years trying not to think about. When he finally wrote back, the letter was short, barely 2 pages, but it contained something he had never shared with Margaret or his children or anyone else, an account of what he had seen and done on D-Day, the beach and the bunkers and the farmhouse, and the German boy whose face he still saw when he closed his eyes. He did not know why he wrote it, did not fully understand the impulse that guided his hand, but when he sealed the envelope and mailed it, he felt something shift inside him, a loosening of a knot that had been tied so long he had forgotten it was there. The correspondence continued for the next 5 years, a slow exchange of letters between Winnipeg and Hamburg that gradually evolved from formal communication between former enemies into something approaching friendship. 2 old men connected by a single morning of violence that had shaped the rest of their lives in ways they were only now beginning to understand. Marie-Claire translated her father's memoir into English and sent it to Arthur, who read it over several nights and wept for the first time since 1944, wept for the men he had killed and the men he had lost, and the decades he had spent pretending that none of it mattered. And when Margaret found him in his study with the manuscript on his lap and tears on his face, she did not ask what was wrong, simply sat beside him and held his hand and let him grieve in the silence that had always been their language. The final irony, the twist that seemed almost too perfect to be coincidental, emerged from Werner Pluskat's memoir. The bunker that Arthur's platoon had destroyed, WN-27, had been scheduled for demolition by the German engineers just 3 days before the invasion, part of a reorganization plan that would have moved the defenders to a different position with better fields of fire, a plan that was postponed because the concrete was needed elsewhere and because no one believed the invasion was coming so soon. If the engineers had followed the original schedule, if the bureaucracy had moved a little faster, the bunker would have been empty on June 6th. The machine gun that killed so many Canadians would have been somewhere else. The assault that cost Arthur his innocence might have been against a different position or no position at all, and all the death and trauma of that morning might have been avoided or at least distributed differently, the calculus of suffering rearranged by a decision made. In an office somewhere by a man who had no idea that he was determining who would live and who would die. Arthur read that passage in the memoir and laughed, a sound that startled Margaret, because she had not heard him laugh in years, and when she asked what was funny, he could not explain, could only shake his head and say that war was absurd, that all the courage and sacrifice and horror came down to paperwork and timing, and the random decisions of clerks who would never know the consequences of their bureaucratic choices. Werner Pluskat had felt the same absurdity, had written in his memoir about the months he spent preparing defenses that were never tested because the invasion came at a different point, the training exercises that rehearsed scenarios that never occurred, the elaborate plans that dissolved on contact with reality, and he concluded that war was not a contest of strategy or courage, but of entropy, the side that managed chaos slightly better than the other side won, and the individual soldiers were merely particles swept along by forces they could neither control nor understand. Arthur died on March 3, 1989, peacefully in his sleep, which was more than many of his comrades had been granted, and at his funeral, the honor guard fired a salute, and a bugler played the last post, and the flag was folded and presented to Margaret, who was 81 years old and who had spent 50 years married to a man she loved but never fully knew. In his papers after the funeral, his daughter Elizabeth found a box that had been hidden in the back of his closet, a box containing the military medal he had never displayed, the photograph of Margaret from their wedding day that he had carried across the beach at Juno, the piece of twisted aluminum that he had picked up from the grass outside the destroyed bunker, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, the correspondence with Marie-Claire Plouscat that documented his late life, reckoning with the events that had shaped him. Elizabeth read the letters over several days, learning for the first time what her father had experienced and why he had been the way he was, and she felt a complex mixture of grief and anger and understanding that would take years to process. The belated knowledge that the silent stranger who had raised her had been fighting a war inside his head that never ended, a war she had not known about and could not have helped with, even if she had. She wrote to Marie-Claire to inform her of Arthur's death, and Marie-Claire wrote back with condolences that crossed the Atlantic like a bridge between two families that had been connected by violence and were now connected by something else, something that might have been called reconciliation, if that word were not too small to capture the complexity of what had passed between them. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, Elizabeth travelled to Normandy for the commemorations, her first and only trip to France, and she stood on Juno Beach at dawn and tried to imagine her father as a young man running through the surf toward the seawall, and she could only see the beach as it was now, peaceful and quiet, the bunkers preserved as monuments, and the sand unmarked by blood, a tourist destination that bore no visible trace of the hell it had. Been 60 years before, she met Marie-Claire there, two elderly women whose fathers had tried to kill each other on this spot, and they walked together along the beach and through the cemetery where the Canadian dead were buried, and did not say much, because there was not much to say, only the presence of two people bearing witness to a history that was slipping from living memory into the pages of books and the frames of documentaries, the transformation of experience into narrative that always lost something essential in the translation. The last surviving veteran of the Queen's Own Rifles who had landed at Juno Beach on D-Day died in 2022, 101 years old, and with him went the last direct memory of that morning, the last person who could say I was there and mean it not as a figure of speech, but as a literal truth. The bunkers remain, most of them, preserved by the French government as historical monuments, and tourists walk through them every summer, reading the plaques that explain what happened in dry educational language that conveys the facts but not the reality, the numbers but not the weight of each number, and they take photographs and buy souvenirs and drive back to their hotels, feeling that they have learned something about history without understanding that history is not something you learn, but something you live, and that the living of it changes you in ways that can never be reversed. The German officers who couldn't stop the Canadian soldiers at Juno Beach, the 800 defenders who lost 11 miles in one day, have become statistics in textbooks, data points in strategic analyses, subjects of documentaries that reduce the complexity of their experience to digestible narratives with clear beginnings and endings and lessons to be learned. But for Arthur Campbell and Werner Plouscat and the thousands of others who were there on both sides, the story had no clean ending, only a continuation that stretched across decades, a wound that never fully healed but that could, with time and effort and the grace of unexpected connections, be acknowledged and carried and perhaps in the end accepted as part of what it meant to be human in a century that demanded more of humanity than it should ever have been asked to give. The photograph of Margaret, the one Arthur carried across the beach, is now in a museum in Winnipeg, donated by Elizabeth after her mother's death, displayed in a case alongside his medals and his letters, and the piece of twisted aluminum from the bunker, artifacts of a moment that shaped a family and a nation and a world. Visitors pause in front of the case and read the description and move on to the next exhibit, and most of them do not linger, do not feel the weight of what they are seeing, do not understand that the faded photograph of a young woman squinting into the sun is a talisman that carried a man through the most terrifying experience of his life, a fragment of love that he clutched against his chest as bullets cracked past his head and friends died in the sand around him. But some visitors do linger, do sense something in the arrangement of objects that speaks to them across the decades, and they stand in front of the case for a long moment, trying to imagine what it would be like to be 23 years old and running into machine gun fire with nothing but a rifle and a photograph, and the desperate hope that you might survive long enough to see your wife again, and they feel, however briefly, a connection to the past that is not about information but about humanity. The recognition that the people who lived through these events were not different from us, not braver or stronger or more heroic, just ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances who did what they had to do and paid for it in ways that can never be fully calculated. That is the legacy of Juno Beach, not the victory or the statistics or the strategic significance, but the human beings who were there, Canadian and German, attackers and defenders, survivors and casualties, all of them real, all of them complex, all of them carrying their own photographs and their own fears and their own hopes that were fulfilled or destroyed on that grey morning in June, and the ripples of that morning spreading outward through time, touching children and grandchildren and strangers in museums, connecting us all in a web of consequence that we can never fully trace, but that we ignore at our peril. The tide comes in and goes out on Juno Beach twice a day, washing the sand smooth, erasing footprints, returning the shore to a state of pristine neutrality that gives no indication of what happened there. And this is perhaps the final irony, that the earth itself does not remember, that the same waves that carried the landing craft to shore now carry tourists and fishermen and children building sandcastles, indifferent to the history beneath their feet, the bones and the bullets and the fragments of men's souls that were left behind when the living moved on to fight another day. The war ended, as all wars end, not with resolution but with exhaustion, not with answers but with the hope that the questions might someday become less urgent, and the men who fought it went home, those who survived, and built lives on foundations that were cracked by what they had seen and done, lives that were real and valuable and meaningful, even though they were shaped by trauma, perhaps especially because they were shaped by trauma, the knowledge of what humans are capable of, both the horror and the resilience, making them appreciate the ordinary miracles of peace that those who have never experienced war can too easily take for granted. Arthur Campbell is buried in Winnipeg, in a cemetery not far from the house where he grew up, and his gravestone says only his name and dates and the word soldier, which is both too much and not enough. A single word that encompasses everything and nothing, that points toward a story without telling it, that invites the curious to wonder but provides no answers, only the silence that was his native language, the silence that he learned on a beach in Normandy and carried with him for the rest of his life, the silence that was his final gift to a world that could not understand what he had been through, but that owed him, at the very least, the courtesy of remembering that he had been through something, that the freedom they enjoyed was purchased with a currency of suffering that could never be repaid, only acknowledged, only honored, only remembered in the imperfect way that the living remember the dead, which is to say, incompletely, inadequately, but with whatever love and gratitude we can muster, hoping that it is enough, knowing that it never is.